Hello, my name is David, and today we're going to be taking a look at George Crumb's Pastoral drone for solo pipe organ. And we'll be taking a particularly focused look on the texture, timbre, and form of the piece, as the method in which Crumb employs development of those aspects, I find to be the most interesting part of the piece overall. It's a very bizarre piece on a first or second listen, but after you listen to it for a while, I think you start to understand that a lot of the stranger aspects of the piece can easily be explained once you have a bit of the background behind what Crumb was intending to do with this piece, as well as a lot of the traditional means of creation that he employed in order to come out with the final product. And so we'll be exploring a bit of that today, page by page. And so the first thing I wanted to do was kind of read verbatim what Crumb has in his program notes about this piece, as I think it's interesting in its simplicity. He writes, Pastoral drone, commissioned by the American Guild of Organists and composed in the summer of 1982, represents my first essay in the solo organ genre. Pastoral drone, cast in one continuous movement, was conceived as an evocation of an ancient open air music. The underpinning of the work is provided by relentless drones executed on organ pedals. The periodic quote-unquote bending of the basic drone sound, a lower D sharp and higher G sharp, spaced as the interval of the 11th, announces the principal structural articulations of the work. The drone is overlaid by strident, sharply etched rhythms in the manual parts, and the dynamic level throughout is sempre fortissimo, boldly resounding. The characteristic sound of the pastoral drone will suggest a kind of colossal musette. George Crumb. I think there's a few interesting aspects about that. Obviously, as the piece is titled, there is a primary drone that kind of envelops the entirety of the piece, and alongside certain aspects of, unclear boundaries between section to section, it sort of connects the piece in a way that's very interesting. Most of the piece's development and form happen atop of the drone, and so you're going to see these two notes they'll kind of swim in and out of this range a little bit, like chromatically speaking, but it'll always arrive back where it began. And so that's the first thing that's worthy of taking note. And so probably the easiest section to kind of isolate here in the beginning of the piece are these first two measures, or two measures mainly. One of the interesting things about this piece is that while there is no implied form, I've taken it upon myself to separate this piece into what is essentially 13 sections. The first of which being this section here. And the interesting thing about how this section develops alongside other sections like it is that you're always going to have that G sharp and D sharp in the pedal part, but how the manuals above interact with it is similar and different as the piece progresses. So what you're essentially going to find is that while this general trend of having you're going to have these parts played here that are going to be half step above or below your main perfect fifth. And the cool thing about that is the fact that you're going to essentially have the same drone being, that boldly resounding sound that he mentioned is going to happen because of this perfect consonant interval. And when that gets kind of distorted by these little bends that he calls them, it creates this interesting situation where these parenthetical notes he has outlined end up simply being the return to what was originally that drone. And so that's the general trend of these kinds of sections. That being said, there are some other interesting aspects about it that I'll explore later. But for now, I'm going to refer to these as the drone sections. They're not too long in isolation, but there's definitely some interesting things to unpack about them. And then, alternatively, we have 7 of those drone sections and 6 of what I call intermittent sections. Sections in between each of those drone sections that have a bit more character in isolation. The first of which begins with this part over here, where the swell has the reeds of 16 inches, 8 inches, and 4 inches playing off these figures over here. Alongside that, this first section features the crumb horn stop that is going to essentially be duetting alongside the reeds, and creates a very interesting back and forth in these intermittent sections. That becomes the trend for any of these sections, and so you're essentially going to have the same few figures balanced out between the two. And so what you're going to find is that if this is, say, the second section of the piece and the first of these intermittent sections, it's still going to be taking its time to try and develop a bit of its own identity, whilst also introducing the general concept for the piece to continue later. And so the first thing that's worthy of note is kind of the quality of the sounds you're working with. The grates in the beginning are actually very plain sounding. They're very airy. But these are very strident stops, like the actual timbre quality. It has kind of a buzzy, bitey sound to it that when over this drone, it can really, really make for a very piercing sound, but it's balanced out pretty well by a very light-sounding drone. And so, as these figures are being played, it's important to take note of the fact that that contrast between the drone and the manual is going to be consistent throughout the piece. And so, the first aspect of these figures that I think is worthy of mention is how very much like the bagpipes or musette they actually are, idiomatically speaking. You have these grace note entrances these grace note entrances that are more or less a call to kind of the imprecision of like starting a note on the bagpipe. If you've ever played a bagpipe, it's very difficult to keep a steady tone, a steady pitch, especially when you're starting, maintaining, or ending a note. And so this entire the entirety of these first few figures here are centered around this B natural. So you have this and that's kind of the cutoff. And then you have the continuation of that in the crumb horn. You know, so you have these really interesting flourishes and ornamentations that kind of surround the B natural, but it's clearly centered around that note. That's sort of the writing, kind of the figure-based reference to the bagpipes, and rather than just the drone that, of course, everyone knows is associated with the instrument. So this first section just has kind of a back and forth between these two voices, and they kind of fit that same theme of writing, though with obviously different tonal centers as it develops. But I think it's very interesting how simple he keeps this first one, given where a lot of these sections go in the future. Now, here on page 5, we have the second drone section, wherein you have a similar looking passage to the one that started, in which you have it's essentially the same figure. Maybe it's a little extended, more or less, with the bends that are used. But another important distinction is that the manual drone that you see is no longer the G flat, the G sharp and D sharp that you have in the pedal. It has now reverted to a D and an A natural, on top of the original drone notes that have been unchanged. And I think it's interesting because those two perfect consonant pairs are kind of offset by a tritone. And so when you actually listen to this piece, it's incredibly jarring to hear. But because the consonants because the intervals are so consonant, it doesn't completely, it doesn't sound like the most dissonant thing in the world. It just sounds unbelievably striking to the ear. And so that's kind of how these sections are developing. They're going to kind of stack on this D and G sharp in the manual by having kind of a different drone figure, and then different drone tonalities, I should say. And on top of that, you're going to have the bends reflect those notes, the new notes, rather than the old. And so that's kind of how the drone sections develop as the piece goes on. But we'll move on to the next intermittent section here, where you have the introduction of the grate without the coupling. So it's going to be a slightly thinner sound, but for the purpose of a bit more of an isolated back and forth between the different ranks here. You have the grate figure here that starts and kind of gets... It kind of... one of the interesting things about these intermittent sections is that some of the voices that kind of begin on a certain chord or note end up kind of sustaining and also accompanying whatever comes after it. So we have an example of that here where the grate part kind of sustains the notes that it lands on after the figure that comes before it, while the crumb horn part ends up taking a bit of a kind of taking the prominent role alongside it. And so they kind of weave in and out of each other. Anytime you'll have a held note on one voice, you'll actually have most likely a rapidly moving selection of notes in another voice, and they kind of just go back and forth in that nature. You'll see that again, like down here where you have the swell rank on this figure that looks vaguely like that bending pitch figure that we saw earlier, da 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 da, But then you'll have this insanely fast, rapidly moving part in the grate that is just all over the place, but is slowly getting faster and faster in terms of general direction and texture. And so that's a common theme amongst sections like this as well, where you'll just have these figures that just they kind of barrel down the page and just kind of snowball, essentially, whilst also being backed up by another voice. Then that trend kind of resets as you approach the end of this section, and then you'll have this same figure that we saw in the beginning just kind of getting repeated, repetition legitimizing, of course. And so we have the swell doing what it did before, right? Where it's kind of the held notes kind of help to progress what's above it by just kind of moving things along. But if you actually look at the grate in this section here, it gets like faster and faster, more and more insane until like the cells are kind of condensed, and then it ends off with the swell actually giving us this really really fast quintuplet 30-second note figure here to end it off. Similarly to how we did in the first intermittent section, where you have these very quick bends at the end. That's supposed to be like the bagpipes cutting off their wind speed, but hitting some pitches along the way. So it kind of takes that initial concept and it grows from there. Here we have the third drone section, wherein you have the same D sharp and G sharp, but this time we go even higher to F and C in the manuals to represent the upper drone, and of course the bends to reflect that. And that just seems to be the general trend of kind of moving upward. Now that does change eventually, but when it does a pretty cool thing that makes these sections in isolation kind of interesting, harmonically speaking. So once that turnaround happens, I'll be sure to point that out. Yeah. So on our way to the third intermittent section, we have we've been having, in between each section, we've been kind of having the pedal take these little forays into just kind of bending and shifting around the D sharp and G sharp, kind of pretending that the notes are going to change or the drone's going to kind of shift along, but it's just kind of there to cleanse the palate, so to speak, before we begin another insane shift in tone color or even kind of alternative tonality in the manuals. So we have this new stop used, which is the cornet on the swell. It's an equally strident tone, but it doesn't sound too so it doesn't sound too dissimilar to the ones we've heard before, but it is distinctly different, and the figure that it's sort of it's being outlined here is very much kind of a, I don't know, it's almost dance-like in how it's applied. It even has the quasi danse down here. It's essentially like a dance, and it's supposed to be playful in nature, while also it kind of continues the same theme of the texture is going to start to get denser and denser as this intermittent section progresses. But until that point, you know, the organ play. I imagine that if I played organ, this would be the most fun section for me, because it would be the most. It sounds almost like a parody of, you know, medieval dance music. That's it gets abruptly interrupted by the grate in this section here, where it's kind of just moving along. It has got a lot of momentum with these triplet 16th notes, and then all of a sudden it's interrupted by this ba-bam, ba-bam figure in the grate that happens a few times, and then it continues, and then it's interrupted again, and then it kind of does this playful back and forth between the two. So if you imagine that these intermittent sections have kind of like a consort of instruments, one on one side of the room and one on the other, they're kind of playing off of each other in a really interesting way, even though it's all coming from the same pipe organ. That's how I like to imagine it. I like to imagine that it's all being orchestrated by multiple players, since, you know, the organ's ability to vary its tone, color, volume is virtually unmatched within a single instrument, to the point where it's almost easier to consider this to be its own orchestra. But yeah, right at the end here, we have this same thing we've been noticing, where we have these rapidly moving pitches that kind of shrink in oscillation. So you start off with these triplet figures that end up kind of barreling through, getting interrupted by the grate. And then at the end here, we have these figures here that kind of cycle off between 2 or 3 notes. So you have like the, you know, so you ended off on this very, very quick quintuplet once more, after having like that back and forth between the 2 notes. That's just the general idea of these intermittent sections. They want to go from a very comparatively wide texture to a very condensed one near the end. I guess that's kind of how he interprets kind of the idiomatic writing style of the bagpipes. If you were playing if you were playing a simple melody, you're still going to have a lot of flourishes and ornamentation alongside any of the notes that you're currently being focused on. All right, and so here we have the fourth of the drone sections, and this is an important one in relationship to the rest because of the fact that we've reached our climax in terms of range for the manual drone, where we have a B and F sharp on the top and the same D sharp and G sharp at the bottom. And what's going to happen at this point, every subsequent drone figure is going to be going back down the proverbial ladder that we've been creating with these drone sections, where before we had, we had the F and C back down. We're gonna have the F and C back down to the D and the A, and then eventually we're gonna find our way back down to the G sharp and D sharp at the very end of the piece. Spoiler alert. But the cool thing about it is the fact that you have 4 different harmonic combinations within these sections that very, very clearly define that they're evenly spaced throughout the piece. And so what you end up coming out with is this really cool, almost like a swell amongst the drone sections. If you were to play them all in isolation with none of the intermittent sections in between, you'd come out with this very cool up and down figure. Like it's almost kind of like a mountain or like a hill. It's really hard to hear that on a cursory listen of the piece overall, but when you actually isolate it, it's very interesting to go back to and try and listen for. So now that I've thoroughly spoiled the trajectory of those sections, let's continue on with the next intermittent section. Now that the halfway point has been reached, we have the first instance of an incredibly high range for the great rank, where, it's kind of duetting alongside what I believe is still the cornet voice, because I believe that's where the positif rank is currently. Let me see here. Let me just double check. So we have the crumb horn. And then no, it was actually the swell that went to the cornet. So this is still on the crumb horn for the positif. It is also in a slightly higher range than it was before, but obviously nothing compared to this car crash of ledger lines up here. So as this figure kind of plays out, you have an example of what I was referring to earlier, where you have these longer note values down here that are contrasted with these very rapidly moving ones over here. And much of the same in much the same way, they kind of play off of each other in that fashion. And so when you have these longer note values over here, you have sort of these more rapidly moving ones on the bottom. So they kind of weave in and out in that sense. And they're articulated very, very sharply because of the nature of these reed pipes, as well as the sound qualities of the great when it's in this range of the instrument. It's incredibly high, and it almost, if you've ever taken those high frequency tests where you try and figure out what's the highest frequency you can still hear, it kind of almost, it's a type of sound that you have to feel almost rather than hear. Now in the context of this piece, it's pretty easy to hear it because of the fact that it's so isolated. The only other thing you're hearing other than these two voices is the drone, which again is a pretty plain sounding drone. It's there to glue the piece together and not necessarily to provide a contextual foundation to these intermittent sections. But much the same way, the same trend that we've been pointing out this whole time, you have these rapidly moving figures that just snowball and snowball until you have these very fast oscillations at the end. And this time it's happening with two voices simultaneously, whereas before you may have one voice that was taking over in that regard. So we're slowly progressing here. All of these intermittent sections have their own kind of development alongside them. And it's very interesting to see the way that each of these voices interact with one another. You don't need to have all three voices at all times in the intermittent section. You can simply have maybe, all right, this one's going to have these two. This one's going to have these two, but this one's going to be the prominent one. You can play around with it. It reminds me a lot of almost like a suite of like small little miniatures in between each of the drone sections. And so it's interesting to see what characters each of what characteristics embody each of those sections. All right, and so here we have what I believe is the fifth drone section, where, as you can see, we're back down to the F and C on top and the G sharp and D sharp on bottom. So we're on our way down, where we've gotten past the tipping point, and so a lot of these drone sections are more so a formality at this point. Like he basically has to commit to the idea as we find our way back down the proverbial mountain. And so I'll point them out when they're there, but other than that, there's not much that changes about these sections, other than maybe a slight duration difference. But yeah, we have more riffing from the pedal as it resettles back into the same D sharp and G sharp that we've come to know and love. So here we have a thinner version of the crumb horn, because we're only going to be using the slightly smaller pipes here. And we have kind of an example of like kind of the Scottish snap, the Scotch snap figure, where we have these very quick note values into a very long note value. Da-dun, dun, da-da-dun, dun, da-da-dun, that kind of very stereotypical like Scottish jig kind of figure is usually where you'll hear a lot of those. And I guess if you're going to try and create the illusion of a bagpipe, it's not a bad option to go with for your for one of the intermittent sections. And once again, we have this very cool. It's a very cool dance-like figure, as he notates over here, that gets brutally interrupted by the grate doing this really interesting descending line in quick that a very rapidly moving notes. And I like to imagine that the positive rank kind of clears its throat during this and says, okay, as I was saying, and then continues on alongside here once more. Wow, that really created a triangle. It kind of continues on the way it was before, and then only to get interrupted again. It's kind of like a back and forth between them. It's almost playful. And then, if you can't beat them, join them. The positive rank then decides, forget it. We're going to just, if this is what you want to do, we're going to do this instead. And then we have these quick little, if you notice these quick little oscillations going down, 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 because that's the way we've come to realize that these sections develop. You have the swell join in with a similar looking figure, but with obviously a quicker oscillation overall. You have the two note ornamentation there, and then we have the grate again, then the swell again, and then they're all just kind of doing this whole back and forth, interrupting one another. And I find this section very amusing to listen to in context, partly because of the fact that it's slowly descending down into like the bass clef notes over here, as all of these voices just kind of copy off of one another. Yeah, so they're definitely developing a relationship between these voices and how they interact. So I find that to be pretty interesting. All right, and so we have our what I believe it has to be at this point. Yep, the penultimate drone section, as well as the final intermittent section after. And of course, we're back to the D and A on top, and the D sharp and G sharp at the bottom. So back to that initial tritone separation that we had. We're going to kind of skip past it. It's pretty much the same thing as before, only now we're on our way back down to ground level. We have one more interjection from the pedal, and then we're into what is probably what I would consider to be the climax of the piece overall, which is the final intermittent section. This would be the this is when kind of everything comes to a head, and you have all of the ranks that we've become accustomed to playing off of one another in some ways, but also doing their own thing in another. So you have these very quickly moving parts here, where you have these alternating. It kind of alternates between these ascending and descending lines, as well as the static notes in between. Which what that kind of creates is this sense of almost an extra voice that's being played, as if we needed even more voices to keep track of. Whenever you have this alternating figure, where every other note is moving up and down this line, but then you have these ones that are staying static, it kind of creates a second voice all in one hand, while the other hand is actually continuing to do this almost like a descending figure, like chromatically speaking, and it also kind of echoes this up and down figure that it begins with, only with sort of a different kind of consonant makeup. So you have these really, really wide intervals that kind of accompany it. And that becomes kind of the language of this final section. But the thing you'll notice is that all three of the voices, for probably the first time in a long time, have an equal contribution in this intermittent section. You have the positive rank, which goes to the cymbal stops here, which, again, doesn't sound too different, but is distinct enough to justify mentioning. You have the swell, which is now on full reed mode, so you're going to hear those articulations very, very clearly on any good organ. And so you're going to have those two for the first part of it, and then you're going to have this really, really cool section here, where you have what starts off as like these very high consonant-sounding pitches, quickly moving into the utmost dissonance when they're held alongside a lot of neighboring notes, and it constantly refreshes itself with each of these figures here. So you have this one, then this one, and then this one, and then it kind of just very, very quickly disorients you, then reorients you. It's kind of like it's a true tension and release, which is one of the themes of this piece overall. There's a lot of very clean sounding consonant intervals, but then there's also these very, very dense cluster chords that kind of just shift in and out depending on the context and mood of the section. Then it's interrupted by the great rank, giving us a little taste of the figure that we had before, that we mentioned. That's kind of the identity of this section of the piece. Then it resets. It does the same thing again. And then, once again, we see even more of this pattern of the great interrupting the positive and swell. It's almost like the positive and swell are kind of fighting for dominance, but then there's this third child over here that just wants just a bit of attention themselves. That's the way I kind of see it, but you have that kind of swelling, and it sort of comes to a head where the great finally takes it takes control of the whole situation, and you're essentially playing both of those figures that we mentioned before simultaneously. And this is actually the last you're going to hear of the great, unfortunately, as we've now approached the transition section that is going to lead us into the end of the piece. So our journey is almost over here. After we have the same rapidly moving ending to the final intermittent section, we have the two. We have two distinct sections here where we add to the pedal. When you hear this in context, it's a very, very powerful thing, because we've been listening to this D sharp and G sharp for the entirety of the piece. But then now we're getting an even more, it's essentially, it's not doubling down, it's more like, septupling down, or whatever the word would be, because we've heard it for so long, but now it's making sure you realize this is where we're going to be centering, this is where we're going to be orienting our ears, as we have these huge swells where we have fully coupled positive ranks, where it does a similar effect to this section here, where it starts off with these very clear sounding pitches that gradually become very clustered, and then you have obviously a bit of riffing from the pedal once more. Then it does it again, and it gets it gets higher and higher in terms of range, but so it kind of gives the illusion that it's getting louder, even though all these sections are in triple forte, and so I think it can definitely give you that sense of, okay, we're going somewhere with this. This is all coming to a very, very grand conclusion. Then after the third one, rule of threes and all of that, we end up at this very, very high, what is this, an A? Where you have the bass, you have the bass voice in the pedal doing its longest riff yet, alongside this, what is about to become a very, very loud section. We have our final three measures of the piece and our final drone section, which ends up being back to the D sharp and G sharp that we've come to know and love. And we're going to even have the same bending figure to kind of bait our expectations, because we're experts at hearing this now. We've heard this many, many a time. We even have the pedal voice joining in on the bending component of it. And then one last tension and release, only in the other direction. We have this split second of bliss with the consonant intervals being played amongst the drone. And then we get this chord here to end it all off. To kind of put into perspective how dense this chord is, it requires the organist to play 3 different notes with their right thumb alone. You'll see that notated actually with this teeny little bracket, if you can see that here. And the interesting aspect of this comes in how long this chord is held for at the end. This is the type of chord that will shake up an entire cathedral and make the whole thing. There's actually a very cool performance of this on YouTube where, this chord just shakes the camera that's filming the organist, just because it's so unbelievably loud. The chord itself is so dense, and it's just a very, very, present sound, to where it doesn't sound necessarily like a chord anymore. It sounds like it's trying to mask an earthquake. And it's one of the most interesting things to hear, from an instrument this present. This is when they show the true potential of an instrument as grand as the organ, because wow, the sheer volume and texture of this is like unmatched. No other instrument can quite replicate that, And so the way I like to interpret this final chord is that of trying to, all the entire journey we've been on so far, sort of, it all culminates in this final chord in a way to where you have obviously the drone that's still playing at the bottom, right? That hasn't changed. But you also have what has to be every single, quality of sound in terms of timbre represented via just one rank that's currently playing in all voices. And so I like to interpret this as being, all three of the main voices just kind of yelling one right after the other. You can almost hear in the dissonance. You can hear a lot of the wavering textures that you've seen throughout all of these sections. You can sort of hear like all of those notes being bundled up together. Just in this time, it's through a cluster chord and not a rapidly moving set of notes, right? So it does the same thing, but through it using a different method, And so that's one of the things I found the most interesting about how the piece ends. It sounds as grand as you'd expect a George Crumb piece to end, but it does so in a way that is self-contained. It references its own material in that sense, not just through the final iteration of the drone section here. And so yeah, that's kind of I think that's kind of a pretty good place to stop it. This piece is very, very interesting to unpack because of a lot of the trends that you notice. But one of my favorite things about it is the fact that when you actually look at the amount of potential there is within a pipe organ solo piece, it's interesting to see how conservative Crumb was with a lot of his choices of sounds. He had this creative vision of having it replicate that kind of the sound of a giant musette, which the sound quality is actually surprisingly limited. You're only going to have essentially 2 to maybe 3 different types of tonal colors being used. And so what he did was he made a lot of these voices have a similar strident tone, whilst also making them sound different enough from each other to have them play off of each other in these intermittent sections. We start off so small, but then little by little we develop into what will eventually become the ultimate culmination, right? And so, if you have any questions about kind of how this piece was perceived by a trombone player, then feel free to sound off in the comments below. But other than that, I just wanted to take a look at sort of what I've been exploring about this piece as of late, and hopefully, after a few listens and a few head-scratching moments, it will become one of your favorite pieces as well. So, with that being said, I'll be signing off, and I bid you adieu. Thank you.